Okay, I suggest we get started. More people joining us, so a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us. It's a very rainy, grey afternoon in the Netherlands, in The Hague, and we know that you're joining us from different places around the world. My name is Eveke de Lauw, and I'll be your facilitator today. And I'm very proud and happy that we have a wonderful guest speaker today on the topic of teaching democracy, living global citizenship. Are we dreaming? And I would actually like to ask my colleague, Professor Laurence Guérin, our Professor of Global Citizenship at the Hague University of Applied Sciences, to kindly introduce our special guest speaker from Canada.
Thank you, Eveke. Thank you, Paul. I'm really honored, and I think Eveke and the Hague University to have you this afternoon. And I have prepared a little introduction, and I wanted to mention that you hold a UNESCO chair with Gina Tézé, and on democracy, global citizenship, and transformative education. And you are also a full professor, and I will say it in French, at the Université du Québec en Outaouais. And you are a very, very prolific writer. So I'm following you since a few years, and I regularly get emails from ResearchGate and academia. Paul cares that you are following, have placed an article. So you have really like 79 articles written on your ResearchGate, book chapters and other. And I know that your background is in sociology, and especially you have done your PhD in sociology of education, and that you are very interested in the area of political science and education as well. And the heart of your research interest is democracy, peace studies, intercultural relations, and transformational changes. So a very dedicated researcher, and I'm so glad to have you and to share with us your thoughts on democracy and global citizenship. Thank you very much, Paul, being here.
And thank you, Laurence, for the great introduction. And obviously, we're very excited to go ahead and listen to Paul Carr. But just a few practicalities that I'd like to go over with you. Most of you have already muted your cameras and also turned off your video cameras. This will greatly benefit the quality of the sound, so would appreciate if you stay unmuted and have your cameras turned off. Please do not click through the slides, because obviously you can understand that would confuse the presenter. If at any moment in time you're experiencing technical problems, then just let me know in the chat. You can find the chat function top bar. You see a little text balloon. If you click on the icon, then you can let me know what's happening, and I can help you hopefully. Paul has a very interesting story to share with us, and he's asked me if you can just hold your questions until the end. There's plenty of time for Q&A, even if we go past 5 o'clock Dutch time. He's more than willing to take a few more questions. So if you can just write down your questions. When I open up the floor for discussion, you can either raise your hand. Again, you see this in the top bar. You just click on the hand and I'll get back to you as soon as we can. Or for a question in the chat, which may be easier because we can see if there are similar questions and we can just combine them. In that case, I will just call upon you. You can unmute yourself and also show your put your camera on. So that's nice that we can actually see who's talking to whom. I would also like to point out that the session is being recorded, and that after this session, that the recording will be placed on a YouTube channel of a Center of Expertise, Global and Inclusive Learning. So if you don't want to be shown on the video, then I would suggest that you stay muted and don't turn on your camera. That's all as far as the practicalities are concerned, and I'm very excited to turn to Paul. So the stage is yours. Enjoy.
Good. Thank you so much, Laurence and Erika. Wonderful to be here with you. And thank you for inviting me. The presentation title is Teaching Democracy, Living Global Citizenship, Are We Dreaming? And I want to first say that I don't speak Dutch, but in solidarity with everyone, this is, I think, where we can connect through global citizenship. And you can correct what I've said there because I really am not sure. It's through Google Translate, but the image is from Argentina, and you'll see a lot of images in this presentation from all over the place. First thing, I wonder if you could just very quickly to yourselves, ask yourself, what is your definition of democracy? How did you learn to live in a democracy? Was your educational experience fundamental to you cultivating some form of a sense of democracy? And do you consider yourself to be critically engaged in democracy, and how? And we'll come back to those concepts throughout this presentation. I'm going to have 5 sections to this presentation. First, questioning democracy, then a little bit on contextual realities, then teaching democracy, followed by living in global citizenship with a model that we've developed. And then lastly, a couple points about the dreaming notion. Alice Walker, a very important African-American writer, said the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And when we think about democracy, what is it we're actually thinking about? I want to start with elections and normative, representative, hegemonic elections, the elections we have in OECD countries, Canada, United States, Europe, and so on, and a few problems that we have with them. And the first is money, which creates a focus on elections. And I think that it also drains scarce resources. Also, there's the question of fundraising, which leads to a disproportionate level of power to donors. There's corruption, rewarding friends, untoward contracts, leading to economic fatalism. And then there's also the taboo subject of spying, arms, supporting and cultivating chaos around the world. The second issue is a lack of democracy, that these elections are not really democratic historically or at present. There's a focus on winning, not on building a democracy. Your candidate must win. It's a winner take all for the most part, that one party takes control of the political power centers. It's an exclusionary democracy. Voting for the lesser evil, I think many of us are subjected to this, leading to thin engagement, trying to block other parties, strategic voting, and so on. There's an effort to distort, misrepresent, and destroy the other. Elites are not interested in social change to disrupt the status quo for the most part. There's often a collusion between the two main parties, and we can see this most predominantly in the United States, but elsewhere, and it maintains a normative political order that is not really challenged and doesn't leave a lot of options open. There's limited accountability to how democracy works, and we can see the issue of First Nations peoples in Canada and around the world, issues that are really unaddressed during long periods of time, generations and so on. And also there's the explicit and implicit support for dictatorships, coup d'etat, and others in the name of democracy. The next part is that elections and campaigns are pretty thin. There's a lot of efforts to restrain voting, discouraging participation. There's also the notion that there's no other way to do anything except through elections. There's too much emphasis on voting, not on citizen engagement, downplaying citizen movements. There's little focus on those who do not vote. And we can see, I'll show a chart in a second, there's large numbers of people who do not vote, and they're essentially excluded from all debate and considerations and policy positions. There's an obsession with getting reelected. The vision is on short-term issues, staying in power, not on long-term building societal movements. There's an overemphasis on personality, distractions, and so on. There's a lot of misrepresentation, propaganda, but that's not new. That's been around for a long time. And there's a hyper emphasis on polling, marketing, strategizing, making sure your candidate wins. And lastly, the capitalism hegemony aspect of elections means that there's a real potential for a xenophobic populism leading to toxic democracy. Capitalism is considered non-negotiable. We really can't move outside of that framework. There's a lot of institutional systemic problems that are avoided, and serious concerns, racism, sexism, and others are really put to the side. For the purposes of this presentation, education for democracy is not really a priority, and we can see the way that we develop this in schools. Limiting participation, engagement, and social change. Normative media coverage eliminates choice. This is one of Chomsky's notions that we can say anything within a very limited, confined framework. And lastly, there's a very limited representation. Wealthy, white, educated, middle-class, Euro-descendant people, kind of like me and others, they're disproportionately represented. And I don't think this is a good thing for democracy. So a few cautionary notes, just to make sure that I haven't misled anyone. Am I saying that people involved in politics are being duped and are corrupt? No, not at all. Am I saying that that normative representative hegemonic system hasn't given us certain rights and social justice gains? Of course it has. Isn't democracy the best chance of social change? I'm not sure. And can't the present system lead to more fuller type of democracy? Well, there are many significant problems and inequities that remain unaddressed or underaddressed. And isn't it cynical to not participate in the present system in order to make it better? And I think that here we all participate willingly and unwillingly, but to seek to enhance society for everyone is not an enemy posture. And also, how can we explain that something better might exist when it is so difficult to imagine? And I think that's the issue of this presentation and in general in education. We live with paradoxes in a complex, nuanced world that is interlaced with inequitable power relations. So having solidarity and empathy with those not benefiting from the status quo should not be discouraged. And lastly, what about education? Won't that help us build the engaged citizenry we need? And I think that without significantly reimagining education, it is unlikely that minor, unsustained, under-resourced peripheral reforms will lead to this critically engaged democracy. So normative democracy is in trouble. There are signs all over the place, not just the voting, but the participation and the tendency to have more skewed and extreme and politicized concerns favoring certain elites and certain groups more than others. Now in the era of social media and vast communications, people are looking to other alternatives and directions. Normative democracy was never really meant to be something inclusive. Women, it's a fairly new innovation that women are fully engaged and participating within the electoral sphere. This isn't to say that women who get elected, who are engaged, are not good or not doing important work like other people, but it's just to note that normative democracy was not intended really to be for the upliftment of all of society. Here we can see in the yellow sections the percentage of people who don't vote, and there are some countries in Europe and Australia where it's 20% or a little bit less, but we go more than half of the countries, it looks like more than 30% or more, 40%, 50% people do not vote. And why is that? And what is the effect? And are they considered part of society? Are their concerns viable? You can see that in Canada and the US and elsewhere, it's kind of flatlined, 55, 60%. And there's a number of reasons why people don't engage. But I think that focusing on elections alone is a very weak barometer of the health of democracy. So how do we consider measuring democracy? And we often look at elections, but we could also look at other areas. We could look at environmental action, military issues, human rights, corruption. There's many ways to consider democracy that go well beyond voting. And I think we have to really reconsider and rediscuss what this means within the context of education and global citizenship. There's probably at least 3 phases of normative democracy that I'll present, and this is one conceptualization. There's others, democracy 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. 1.0 is probably the democracy up until around the 1960s or so. And here we can see that the notion is that there's a supremacy of elections, there's a clearly defined hegemony, limited interest in equity, political parties are key, there's a media control, very clear and normative media, mass media, limited citizen participation, normative institutions, patriotism and nationalism, war and conflict are political levers. And we have capitalism without really a human face for the most part, although, you know, there are unions and there are other issues, but, you know, it's fairly clear that, you know, there's a certain hierarchy. Democracy 2.20 is from about 1960s to the present. And here we have an emphasis on elections, but there's a sustained but contested hegemony. There's a stronger interest in equity. There's political parties, but still there's a bit more choice. There's diffuse media now with more alternatives, social media, the internet, cross-boundary citizen participation, contested institutions, and there's more fluid identities, allegiances. War and conflict are much more sophisticated, and we have capitalism with a smile. Just keep working. Democracy 3.0, which is about for the last 5 or 10 years and continuing, it's more that power is more diffuse. There's contested, but also a reinforced hegemony. There's controlled and visceral interest in equity, political credibility problems. There's a lot of surveillance and algorithmic media, and we see this in many ways with social media. There's controlled and uncontrolled citizen participation. People are moving well beyond the electoral sphere. There's authoritarian and hostile institutions, more enhanced mini-publics, war and conflict become virtual, and we have neoliberalism on steroids. So what I'd like to say is that all 3 of these are functioning at the same time. We're moving away from elections as being the fundamental central issue of democracy, but at the same time we're hooked into it. And we're moving away from kind of a mainstream media narrative, but at the same time there's a tension here with surveillance and algorithms and different types of mobility around the world. Here are some thoughts, synthesis on democracy based on the work we've been doing over a long time. First, that democracy is a process, not a finality. It must be dynamic, dialectical, inclusive. There has to be meaningful engagement and dialogue, otherwise it will just die out. Transformative education, you know, including political media literacy, need to be cultivated. We're not born democratic. We have to develop that, and education is the key lever. War and violence and so on is antithetical to any sort of meaningful democracy, but we've shaped our normative democracies around this notion of strong militarization and so on. Elections are a very small part of democracy. They can even diminish the strength of democracy in many regards. Power relations need to be more fully critiqued. And hierarchical forms of democracy lead to alienation. And finally, defining and conceptualizing democracy needs to be more ingrained in societal debate. Some contextual realities, of course, I'm just going to go through them quite quickly, but there's 3 that I'd like to focus on: racism, social media, and the environment, which affect all of us, no matter where we are. And we've been locked into now with this pandemic that we need to be connected. We need solidarity. We need global solutions, global interactions, global efforts. So we have to move away from kind of nationalistic considerations, but at the same time, we can see a retrenchment towards national functioning. The first is racism, and of course Black Lives Matter has gone globally, but there's also global movements for forever, and we can see that although we don't have a language for it often, or it's not really commonly used, or people point to the United States as being the problem, but it's everywhere. And I think this is a model that I developed with Gina Tizé, the racism iceberg, and we can see that we see a lot of individual racism and acts and so on, the tip of it, but that's really not the main piece of racism. It's more what we don't see, the institutional racism, societal racism, civilizational racism, potential racism. And this is infused throughout all societies, even in Haiti, which is almost 100% black. There's colorism, and it affects all aspects, employment, incarceration, education, culture, everything. Social media, and we can see the Social Dilemma documentary out now, really focuses drills down on how algorithms and how social media applications are focused on controlling and monitoring and surveilling and taking account of all of our activities and influencing what we do. We can see in the chart on the left that we've moved from shopping to going out to having interactions. These are global concerns. I do have a question, though. I think social movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter in Canada, Idle No More, Arab Spring, I think there was a social media genesis and synthesis that provided a landscape so people could function together at certain levels. So there's a lot of problems with social media, but there's a lot of problems before social media as well. And lastly, the environment. We can see we're affected by global warming, climate change, islands are disappearing, icebergs are melting. And this chart on the left is also that I developed with Untitled. It's a way of understanding the vulnerability of certain groups and people through our socio-political, economic, and ecological actions. Are they predictable? What are the costs and benefits, the vulnerability? So we can see these three contextual realities, and each one has specific ways of considering them through education: environmental education, media literacy education, anti-racism education. And I want to, for the purposes of this presentation, not to obfuscate any one of those, but to try to include them within a framework of education for democracy and global citizenship education. And there's some of the models we've developed through thin and thick models. We can do this in a thin way or a thicker way, depending on the leverage that or the emphasis we'll place on each. So teaching democracy. Here are some themes from the research that we've been undertaking for the last 15 years or so in relation to education for democracy. The first is that the language is highly problematic and contested. What do we mean by democracy? What do we mean by citizenship, and so on? And I think that it's very important for people to engage in research on democracy. This is really pivotal to having us understand it, and we have to do democracy. So the process of engagement and dialogue can be really positive on the effect, on the agency of educators, students, and others. It's surprising how often we do not talk about democracy. We do not define it. It's in a policy document, but it really isn't fleshed out. It's not an outcome. The discomforting reality of normative hegemonic representative democracy can be toxic, and it can often shut down debate. Ironically, the same democracy that is supposed to allow us to be free, emancipated, can often obfuscate debate. The thin democratic experience in and through education can be destabilizing. In our project, we had an Education for Democracy project with roughly 5,000 participants in 15 countries with investigators, and we found that the majority of people in education, teachers, teacher educators, they themselves acknowledge that they had a very thin democratic experience, and this has affected the way that they consider engaging in democracy themselves in their educational work. The power of formal and informal education to influence societal movements is really, really fundamental if we want to have real democratic change. The common international experiences juxtaposed against isolated local actions. I think we often think that we're isolated. This is something affecting only us, but in our travels and the UNESCO chair, we've met people in many countries who are experiencing quite similar realities: neoliberalism, social injustice, social inequities, solidarity, and so on. Neoliberalism has a major effect on how we learn, what we learn. There's often a disconnection from these fundamental macro level realities, which is really nefarious. There's a weak focus on social justice despite the rhetorical support. And there's a lot of examples of movements and projects and experiences that offer hope that are really extremely creative and are wonderful exemplars of what we can do that need to be considered, I think, more fully within the educational project. The marginalization of education for democracy within formal education, including teacher education, is a problem. And we need to connect better with civil society in and through education, I think, in order to do democracy. And of course, I mentioned earlier, media literacy, peace education, and so on. And lastly, there's a problematic concern over how do we do democracy? And of course, we do it in many different ways. So we have to really kind of consider how we can reinvigorate that type of thinking. And of course, I'm using Paulo Freire's work and from critical pedagogy and others. This is a framework that we developed to understand education for democracy and what happens in schools. And often when we talk to people about democracy and education, they'll point to a course or a teaching perspective. And in this model, we look at 7 variables: curriculum, pedagogy, lived experience, leadership, epistemology, institutional culture, and educational policy. And they're all interlocked, they're all important. I'll share the presentation if people want to delve into it a bit further. But I think that institutional culture is probably one of the most important variables to developing, cultivating, questioning, problematizing democracy. This is the thick, thin spectrum of education for democracy. We have about 15 different variables here that we can use. But the idea is that in any given area, we can look at a topic very thinly or in a more thick way, more open-ended, more critical, more context-based, more engaged. And I think when we look at education, it's not just what we teach, it's how we teach. And it's not just what we do, but how we do it. This is a spectrum of critical engagement, and it tries to develop a sense of how we kind of develop individually at school level, educational level, system-wide level. How do we consider engagement and what do we do to cultivate it and so on? And it's a never-ending linkage, but it looks like at the top level we have conscientization, but this never ends. And what we found is that when we first started doing our research, we thought in the bottom, when there was a refusal, rejection, hostility, that this meant that people were disengaged. We've come to understand, no, these people are engaged, but they're engaged in a way that might be different than we normatively want them to be. It's the people in the middle: indifference, superficial actions, rhetorical commitment, expressed interest, self-interest, engagement. That this in the middle is where often we're at within education, but it's not really thick, engaged citizen participation and democratic action. I want to talk just for a few minutes about global citizenship, and we can see that we're interconnected in many ways, and I won't go over this, but UNESCO has developed this quite a bit. I think the main thing is that global citizenship education aims to be transformative, building the knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes that learners need to be able to contribute to a more inclusive, just, and peaceful world. Takes a multifaceted approach, employing concepts and methodologies already applied in other areas, including human rights, education, peace education, and so on. It's very difficult to do global citizenship education. Often there isn't a place for it. It's something where we say that we're interested in doing, but it's very difficult. These are sustainable development goals that UNESCO, the United Nations have developed, and it's a lot of work that requires power relations, distribution of resources, realignment of emphasis, of goals, and so on. And I think, in my own humble opinion, it's kind of on the margin still of major debates, but it's something that's very important as a tool. This is the logo of our UNESCO chair, and just to say that we kind of thought through it, so there is some meaning behind it with the 4 elements: air, water, earth, and fire, and 4 colors: green, blue, brown, and red. And so the notion here is that there's a coherent whole. The 3 axes: democracy, air, green; global citizenship, water, blue; transformative education, earth, brown, are connected by red-orange arcs, forming a circle which symbolize the energy that is necessary to make the axes dialogue in their diversity, their complexity, and their complementarity, but also in despite of their points of rupture and tensions. And I think this is in a way we use to try to understand that we can't just look at democracy alone or global citizenship or transformative education, but they're interlocked in a more organic way. Global citizenship education, of course, has a constellation, a crystallization of different values. It's an ecosystem of educational finalities, goals, and objectives. And we can see here that what are we thinking about? Well, living together. En français, in French, we say vivre ensemble, buen vivir in Espanol and Spanish, and sustainability. What does that mean? It's not just extraction of resources, social and environmental justice, human dignity, plural societies. So there's a range of things that we're thinking about. These are conceptual models, but education is directly and viscerally connected to them. This is another model related to understanding democracy and citizenship at the different levels. Lucie Sauvé was key in influencing us as well on this, but the self-identity related to transformative knowing, how do we be, how are we, ethics and so on. Then we relate to others, the alterity, transformative learning, dialoguing, there's pedagogical and praxical, epistemological dimensions. And then we look at institutions, these local communities and so on, transformative participation, acting together. And then with the world, the global community, transformative learning, living to live with the world. This doesn't mean that we don't have national identities, local identities, but it does mean that we are connected to the world. This model looks at education and global citizenship. It's a complexified developed with 4 dimensions and 4 theoretical perspectives. And I'm going to go through it quickly, but once again, I'll share it. And essentially what we have is 4 types of education on the left-hand side, and then 4 theoretical or ideological orientations on the top, the positivistic, relativistic, sociocritical, and ecological. The first is education about global citizenship, or we developed it from our education about democracy. Here we have an emphasis on facts. No matter where we are in education, we have to learn some facts. It's a formal dimension. The question is what facts? And so if we looked at it in the positivist unicity category, it's knowing facts about global citizenship in one dimension. It's unidimensional, it's the normative hegemonic way. The relativistic category looks at it more in understanding these facts in multiple ways, multiple dimensions. The sociocritical analyzes these facts according to different stakeholders' interests. And here we're looking at engagement, active participation. And lastly, the ecological considers these facts to prepare the educative soil. It's a metaphor of the earth, a sense of belonging to Mother Earth, planet, and so on. The second level is education through global citizenship. And here we have an emphasis on actions, praxis-based dimension. And within the positivist category, we can see that we're focused on following rules and duties, responsibilities. We have a passive citizenship. Secondly, the relativistic is more of an active global citizenship, participating in multiple formal and non-formal structures. The sociocritical category looks at critical global citizenship. We're engaging in social transformations through social critical praxis, diverse contexts, solidarities, dialogues. And then lastly, the metaphor of water, living the flow of global citizenship through the presence of the world, feeling, thinking, relating to others. The next level is education in relation to global citizenship. And here we have an emphasis on knowledge, epistemological dimension. The positivistic area looks at it in a more monodisciplinary manner, accepting global citizenship knowledge as dynamic of collecting data. The relativistic looks at it as more of a multi-disciplinarity phenomenon, multiple viewpoints. The sociocritical, we deconstruct global citizenship here, different types of knowledge. It's interdisciplinary. And lastly, the ecological looks at it more in a transdisciplinary way in relation to viable knowledge and power. And the last segment is education for global citizenship. And here we have an emphasis on principles and values, the ethical dimension. Within the positivist realm, we look at it more in a behaviorist way, behaving according to global citizenship principles and values. Within the relativist, it's more cognitive, developing critical thinking, progressive citizenship. And the socio-critical, it's looking at engaging in these global citizenship principles and values in the process of global critical consciousness. And lastly, the holistic aims for the ecological dimension, igniting the passion for these principles. What I'd like to say is that in education, in order to ignite global citizenship, education for democracy, we have to do all four of them concurrently at different levels in a thick, engaged, critical way. We do need facts. We do need actions. We do need reflections. We do need knowledge, internalization, and we also need conscientization and a reevaluation of the ethical dimension. So this model seeks to kind of illustrate many of the dimensions that we might want to think about for global citizenship. So are we dreaming? And I like Frantz Fanon's analysis about cognitive dissonance. And he says sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit within with the core belief. And I think this is where we're at with democracy. We've been told that we are democratic, but we're not really given the emphasis within education to function at a really high level in order to deconstruct it, problematize it, and consider other variables and ways of doing. Noam Chomsky says that as long as the general population is passive, apathetic, diverted to consumerism or hatred of the vulnerable, then the powerful can do as they please, and those who survive will be left to contemplate the outcome. So here are a few ideas, proposals, suggestions for developing democracy and education and global citizenship, and there are many others. And I think in our own work, we're quite open and humble about it, that I think it's a collective process. It's not from one area, one person, one group, top down. We did the research project on democracy, political literacy, and transformative education. It can be found online. There were 75 proposals in this in relation to the 7 components of the model we presented: pedagogy, curriculum, institutional cultural leadership, epistemology, informal learning, and educational policy. And we have specific recommendations on what we can do in each one of those areas, so that might be helpful. I think the first is also we need to collect and analyze data. What is the problem? What are the problems? What are the questions? We should consult with teachers, educators, students. What do you see as the issues in relation to democracy? And go well beyond the voting dynamic. Consult with all constituencies, develop objectives and plans, provide accountability reports and evaluations. Go beyond the short-term vision. Tie administrator and principal contracts and performance to achieving democracy and global citizenship goals. If we don't, then we just risk having people being shifted from one school or school board to another, and we have to have more bona fide accountability. Set aside designated funding for formal and informal projects for democracy projects in education. Formal and informal activities and teaching and learning. Let's allow people some leverage, some participatory budgeting to determine how they want to actually ignite their own global citizenship realities. Make significant and meaningful linkages to civil society groups, involve them in the educational process, rethink evaluation from A to Z, link it more to critical engagement, citizenship, and education for democracy. Link classes and schools with one another, diminish competition, develop projects and link them to education. Provide teachers with release time to develop praxis-based projects, integrate deliberative democracy and controversial issues throughout all classes. Make addressing racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination and marginalization a priority. Advancement and graduation should be based on connection to global citizenship. It shouldn't be something that is mentioned in a sidebar way. So I'll finish with Paulo Freire, who said that love is an act of courage, not of fear. Love is commitment to others. As an act of bravery, love cannot be sentimental. As an act of freedom, it must not serve as a pretext for manipulation. It must generate other acts of freedom. Otherwise, it is not love. So I think that we're talking about love when we think about solidarity and social justice. And once again, Paulo Freire made this comment that I think is quite germane. Education does not change the world. Education changes people. People change the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for sharing all these insights, and I think you covered a lot of ground. Many thanks for that. And I'd like to open up the floor for questions or comments from everyone who's joined us this afternoon. So either type your question, comment in the chat box or raise your hand, and then I'll turn to you, and maybe you can unmute yourself and show yourself on camera as well. I see Yannick from Brno University. Yannick, maybe you can unmute yourself and turn on your camera and ask the question.
Hello, and thank you. Yeah, I'm greeting you all from the Faculty of Education of Maastricht University, and I would like to first thank you for the great opportunity to join this talk on democracy and global education. Like on your presentation, if I may. Yes, there are global issues, there are global efforts, but at the same time, a re-entrenchment back to nationalism or to self-interest is quite apparent. I believe it's also because John Rawls' overlapping consensus is or was a myth, and liberal or neoliberal ideas as such simply do not work globally in democracy. But what do you think? Because towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned deliberative democracy, and I that made me think of Amy Goodman, you know, and for example, and I still sort of hold hopes towards deliberative democracy and perhaps more cosmopolitanism as well when it comes to global education. What is your view on that, deliberative democracy as such?
Yeah, thank you, Yannick, for that question. And I think that deliberative democracy is central, it's pivotal. We need to learn to debate, to understand, to argue with others without literally killing one another. We have to focus on how do we cultivate these ideas. And often we hear expressions where people say, I don't want to talk about politics and religion. It's as though that to talk about things that concern us are taboo. So I think that education plays a pivotal role. And one of the things we found in our research project is that many educators around the world do not wish to engage in controversial issues. They don't want to take a side. They feel that it's nefarious. And really, deliberative democracy, as you know, it's not about taking a side. It's about opening up debate. When we talk about war, it's not we're for or against, but what are the dimensions, the implications, the voices? And so I think that deliberative democracy is key. But it's not enough. It's one component, and I think that we have to emphasize more in teacher education, teacher training, in support of educators, and to create a political culture whereby we can talk about these controversial issues. And as you know, with Black Lives Matter right now, because of the death of George Floyd around the world, there are a lot of conversations about this, but where were those conversations before? It wasn't just George Floyd that ignited this. And now we're seeing also a waning of these conversations, but it's very hard to discuss something such as racism in schools. It's considered to be controversial and so on. So myself, I'm fully for the notion without having a final conclusive answer on racism, but opening it up to understand who are the people affected, what are the dimensions, what are the voices. And I think this is the only way we'll be able to create some sort of meaningful democracy.
Maybe Laurence, because we've often spoken about deliberative democracy, I'd like to maybe see if you would like to add anything.
Well, I agree with Paul, and I've done some research in primary and secondary schools where we have used deliberative democracy as a model for children to discuss on controversial issues. And what you notice, it asks a lot of the teachers to be able to help the pupils, but also to leave pupils free to make their own judgment and decision about the controversial issues. And it takes a lot as a teacher to leave this freedom for the children. And it was very interesting. And this is a point that we are looking into in The Hague University, in how we could stimulate discussion, deliberation, debates, and other kinds of ways of raising issues that are actually actual in our institution and outside the institution. But it asks a lot of us and from the students as well. It's not an easy task.
Thank you, Laurence. There's also a question, Maya Zuiderveld, you raised your hand, so maybe you can unmute and turn on your video camera.
Yes, hello. Thank you for organizing this big conversation, and Mr. Carr, thank you very much for everything you explained so far. What I would like to know is, you pointed out that teachers have very thin democratic experience, and well, we have to do it with that now in education. So how could we thicken that experience they have? Because I think maybe part of teachers being able to have that controversial discussion in their classroom has to be that they can at least have that discussion with another.
Yeah.
So what's your vision on what teachers need and where they would get that?
Yeah, thank you, Myra. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I think that there's a few things that we could think about directly, and they're not easy, but I think the teacher education program can more fully inject deliberative democracy, social justice, integration of inclusionary activities, people. For example, Black Lives Matter. I think we should be talking to Black African origin people, have civil society groups. There's many different ways to do this, but so I think that within school boards, school systems, there can be more openness. Educational policies also have to be open. So I'm not saying there's one or the other, but I think education policies are helpful for giving people an area to explore. But then there are other informal spaces. Teacher education, this is my own assessment, is relatively thin for these controversial deliberative democracy activities, social justice activities. There often are courses and activities, but they have these practicum stages and experiences, and often they aren't really unpacked. And we know that students come in, they have a lot of courses, a lot of things they have to do, and they're kind of accumulating all of these pieces to their portfolio. But I think the main thing, we're members of a society, and a national or global, is that we want societies that aren't racist and sexist and that are open, and we can do something about poverty and all of these big issues. So I kind of adhere a bit to Bourdieu's notion of the reproduction of social relations, that often we kind of know what's happening in education by these inputs that are going into it. And I also question, the students in teacher education, and I'm not questioning their ethics or their intentions, but I'm wondering, when they go into the program, are they going into it for social justice, deliberative democracy, social change, or are there other motivations? So I think that we can rethink education at many levels. And there's so many people here, Laurence and Evika and others around the world that are doing interesting work. But I think the interesting work is happening in spite of the formal barriers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maya, for your question. Laurent, so is there anything you would like to add from your perspective?
Well, I agree with Paul that in education we have to do a lot of things, and we had this morning a discussion about critical thinking and citizenship and how we can equip teachers in order to be able to discuss issues that are actual, but in a way that it deepens the understanding of students about democracy and power relationship and social justice. And we had discussed this with the MBO Raad, so it's organization, and the ministry on what do we need in education to be able to attain such deeper understanding about democracy and citizenship within our institutions. So it's very interesting. I hope to work with you, Paul, on this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's good to hear that's on the agenda.
Add to what we were talking about too. To hear that on that level there is discussion at this very moment how we should get it into the institutions and what we have to do. Because you can get it into the teacher training, but we already have a lot of teachers that are not in the training anymore and still will work for that many years and who have to be trained too.
Yeah, thank you for that addition, Maya. That's definitely something to consider. And in different countries, there are different practices. We do know in higher education that there are professional development courses for lecturers. Again, mostly focused on the ones who are starting out as a lecturer, and hopefully we'll be able to develop more of the senior qualifications where members of staff that have been with us for a longer time may also be in a position to develop such competencies. I see another question popping up. I'd like to turn to Paul Nixon.
Yeah, hi, Paul. I'm just wondering how you feel about the fact that in neoliberal societies, to encourage equality and challenge entrenched power in your lectures is often defined as indoctrination and is viewed as a very negative aspect. How do we get around this?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I think that we're in a real quagmire, aren't we? We can see what's happening in elections, our neighbor to the south here and elsewhere. And I was going to say that at the same time as we're arguing here, I think collectively we need more deliberative democracy, social justice. I think the trend is going against that there's more populism, more xenophobia, and more nationalistic thinking. And I think that the neoliberalism, I always try to remind myself, I'm just one individual like everyone else, that we have this kind of ethos in universities and in schools that we have policies and we have directives and people need to learn. But I keep in the back of my mind, and I know I'm tenured, so maybe I'm less at risk, but what about the people who are disadvantaged, who are marginalized, people who really aren't benefiting in the least from the system? In fact, what we're doing is tormenting them further. And I think that that's what we can do. We can form alliances. We can work on different types of projects. I think civil society is a very interesting way. There are social movements. There are others, but also I know that Paulo Freire's first book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, was not published by a university press, and it could have easily been discredited and not published because really it wasn't an important academic work. So I'm inspired by many people who I've met through critical pedagogy and in different parts of the world who are doing really important work that they aren't noticed and at the formal level in ministries of education and in the mainstream media, but there are a lot of movements out there, and I think Paul, my own feeling is that neoliberalism, people are feeling very, very agitated and disrupted by it. But we have these formal normative processes that tell us this is the way it is. And we can see that sometimes tax cuts and bailouts and other programs are sought to help people who are already more or less benefiting. So this is the project. I think your question is one of the projects that we need to think about globally, and there are a lot of people doing really excellent work. The American Educational Research Association, I've attended many of their conferences. There's often 15,000 people, and there's people from around the world, but mainly from the United States. And they have 200 special interest groups. And, there's a couple dozen that look at issues, Marxist issues, Paulo Freire, social justice. And so I think everyone is, they're working how they can. But I think your question is, how do we link up better? How do we have better solidarity? How do we influence policy? I will say that because of George Floyd, although I've been working on anti-racism for roughly 30 years, the last couple months there's been an opening to work on anti-racism that wasn't there for many years before, sadly, because of what happened. But it's a small window. And I think my own view is through this, the work with the UNESCO chair, is that I think we have to be much more open and much more humble with proclamations, not us specifically, but in general in relation to education. And educational policy is formulated above. And I worked in the Ministry of Education previously, and we had a joke, and you may not find this funny, but we said there's two things you don't want to see being made. One is sausage, and the other is educational policy. It's not pretty. So it's not often based on research. It's not often based on full needs, but we need to continue. And UNESCO itself is really underfunded. The United States pulling out, and a lot of projects with developing countries in the global south. This is a global project, I think, in my mind, education for the world. So I can see signs, though, of a lot of rupturing against neoliberalism, but I think the normative democratic structures are not there yet.
Thanks.
Laurence, I saw you grow quite excited at this question. So anything you would like to comment on?
Yes. What I think we need to engage with the students, because we have students who are perhaps more left and who are more right. And I've done research in our university, and there are students complaining about the fact that they are, even if they are from right, have the feeling they are not allowed to speak out their political thoughts and things like that. And I think we should, and this would be a basis of deliberative democracies, to engage with everyone and to engage with these students as well, and be able to discuss. And perhaps we won't find any solution, but I think it's very good sometimes to engage in this kind of conflicts and to go and experience what are the limits, and in both parties that would be engaging the discussion. So I hope that we can create within the Hague University a safe space to be able to do such things.
Great, thank you, Laurence. And it is 5 p.m. in the Netherlands. I'm conscious of everyone's time, but if people still feel the need to post questions or make comments, and Paul's kindly agreed to stay on a little bit longer. But if you would like to leave, then that's absolutely fine. But I would really appreciate it if before you leave, that in the chat you leave us a little comment. How did you experience the session? What resonated with you, and maybe what questions still linger on your mind, so that maybe for our next big conversation we can address those questions. I think we need to make sure that these big conversations are quite focused on certain needs as well, but also thought-provoking at the same time. So just before you leave us a comment in the chat, please. So really appreciate your feedback. And I see we have another question that has just come up. So Michiel Verkuilen, I can like to turn to you.
Yes, hello, it's very interesting. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a bit of a longer question. I'm a political scientist as well, and it goes more like the fundamentals. I wrote it down. Maybe I put it in the chat and you can read it, and that's maybe easier than to say it out loud. Okay?
Okay, that's fine. Michiel, just put your question in the chat, and we can take a look at that in a few moments. Let me just check if there's anyone else who'd like to ask a question. And just raise their hand, but then it's lowered again, so I might have missed you. No, I don't think there's any further questions.
I'm sorry. It's a bit long, I'm sorry.
Paul, can you read the question? I can read it out as well. Don't you think that the idea of global citizenship in itself is fundamentally a very Western concept, as it centers mainly around values that are at the core of Western civilizations, or are the result of the Enlightenment in the West, like liberty, tolerance, fraternity, freedom, and equality, while more tribal or nationalistic communities hold very different values like loyalty, tradition, and culture, to preserve, for example, cohesion that perhaps is undermined by globalization and transnational organizations. Quite a relevant question. I think there's a lot of discussions also on decolonizing the curriculum and learning and you know, turning to underrepresented voices. What would you like to say to Michiel?
Yeah, Michiel, thank you so much. Wonderful question. And I think this is where we get to the point where we have to engage more as individuals, communities, societies, nations. What are we talking about? And globalization, of course, has been fully denounced, and does it mean economic hardship and so on. And global citizenship is also something that is unknown. Even played tennis the other day, and the fellow asked me, what do I do, and what kind of research? Global citizenship? No, I don't want global citizenship. And so there's a whole tendency. The notion of global citizenship that we have in our little UNESCO chair is, how do we reconcile and address these fundamental social inequalities around the world related to racism, environment, migration, wars, things that disproportionately affect certain communities, minorities. Now, UNESCO and a lot of these initiatives emanate from the north, and there's kind of a rubber stamp from the south, or imposing it on them. But in my own ideological mindset, the notion here isn't to kind of drive kind of Western hegemony down the throats of people who have already been victimized through colonialism and slavery and so on. But I think that it's a process that involves a lot of dialogue and recognition of power relations, inequitable power relations. And I think this is one of the dilemmas we have in education in Western countries and OECD countries, is that we constantly view it from the vantage point, our vantage point, so to speak, and kind of the white vantage point, or the conqueror's vantage point. And it's hard to address these fundamental issues such as indigenous rights, you know, colonialism and power relations. And I think that nationalism is a tributary of this legacy of colonialism. And I think there is some hope, though, for looking at social movements and solidarity that goes across national lines. And I guess that's where I would say that my thinking around this is that global citizenship, and it's a term, and I'm not fully vested in this term, the same way I'm not fully vested in multicultural education or anti-racist education or peace education. These are terms, but the notion is trying to build some sort of solidarity to confront these hegemonic processes that have disproportionately disadvantaged many people around the world. And I think that what's interesting about global citizenship, at least if we take in the environment, is that this is a global enterprise, like the pandemic right now. And the question is, how do we reconcile? Because we won't really advance much further if we only do it in the Netherlands or Sweden or Canada. So I think that that is the start of an answer, but I take your point that often these concepts are developed in the North, and we've participated in many workshops and conferences related to global citizenship, and it's almost as though these Northern OECD countries are inviting people from the South to participate, and there's an inequitable relationship. But having said that, I think that there's some frameworks there that might be helpful for us to build solidarity and address these serious global problems.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very relevant question, and something that we have to critically ask ourselves constantly. There's more of a practical question by David. David, maybe you'd like to unmute yourself. Maybe not. Can you hear us, David? Okay, he just says 1 sec. Then I can just maybe ask a question on your behalf, David. You asked how to effectively empower students to participate at the core of their institutions. There you are. Good to see you, David.
Yeah, hello. Good to see you again. And thank you for opening up this space. Thank you, Paul, and all of the people at the Hague University. We really appreciate that. Well, there is often a situation, it is that in theory, we try to empower students to participate, to engage in a democratic process. But at the small, at the community, especially the academic community, in which they usually face issues that they would like to speak out or be heard, usually they don't. At least I observe that. I don't teach, but I have been observing this from students who approach me from time to time, and they feel disenfranchised. They feel that their voice is not taking. That they don't know how to bring it up, and it's usually for things, small actions in which they wanted to be heard of. Example, they are not happy with how the process of the class is going. They would like it to be better, but they are afraid to talk to the teacher. They don't know how to pass that concern to the academic senate. The students that are in the academic senate usually complain that they are afraid to speak up because teachers or people with degrees usually have more control of on these bodies. So there is if you really think about it, there is a systemic issue, even at the institutional level, which does not allow students to properly feel comfortable participating. How are we going to get them even to participate in a wider society?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, David. I think that your question illustrates that we're probably not in a democracy that a meaningful democracy, a robust, socially critically engaged democracy. We're talking about here inclusion, accessibility, and I guess my first point would be that we probably shouldn't wait for the institution to legitimize or give us credibility to function. We should maybe look at the spectrum of formal to informal, and at some level we want to have formal engagement, formal recognition, but we have a lot of informal interactions, and I think we can maybe look at students are members of society, social society groups, civil society groups, look at systems, processes, frameworks, and interactions, and all of those within the framework of trying to develop authentic, meaningful relations. And I think the worst thing is that if an institution says, okay, we're giving you an office and $1,000 and here you can then present at the Senate, well, it's not authentic. It's more or less co-optation. And so I think that these are some of the questions that we've been thinking about for a long time, for centuries, citizen participation. How do we get beyond the alienation? How do we bring people together? And they can be political movements, but they can be social movements. And I would say be very leery of an institution giving you some authority. It might be inauthentic. It might not be for the right reasons. Now, if professors and other personnel are not interested in engaging in a meaningful way, then I think that this is an important issue to raise as well. And I think it's not a specific issue to your institution. This is a common issue in relation to power relations. And this is, I think, one of the points I was trying to make about education, is that we should go beyond the facade of saying we're democratic to really kind of look at what type of agency teachers have to actually work with people and construct these generative ideas and so on to develop democracy. So I think that might be one of the questions you might want to ask the rector, the principal, the president of the university. What is your process to develop deliberative democracy, participatory democracy, to really have people engaged, to feel meaningful, to develop social justice? And then from there, what are the inputs, what are the processes? But outside of that, I would always say, don't just go the formal route. Try to develop other alliances and processes. And there are a lot of very good student movements around the world, in Latin America in particular. You may be from there or aware of them, but I think that power is a very nebulous, nefarious, paradoxical thing, and so I think that there's many ways that we can have significant change, and there have been many significant changes over time. But I would say look to build coalitions, look to have more deliberative democracy, and engage at different levels, formal and informal.
Thank you, Paul. Laurence, maybe as I think we'll be sort of near the wrap up of the session. But your thoughts on this?
Yes, I think there have been some, the last 20 years, a lot of research on student voice and students as partnership and so on. And as Paul pointed, you have to see what is the motivation to establish, to hear the voice of students. Is it more an instrumental thing using your student, or is it really to empower your students to make decisions within your institution and to take seriously their voice into consideration? And we have just submitted this morning a grant for the Dutch Council in order to be able to implement such a change within the Hague University, and to work together with students and teachers and managers on how do we want to really work as a democratic institution, and not only saying that we want to have global citizens, but really do something about it. And I think this is an effort everyone has to do within an institution.
That's great news, Laurence, and yeah, obviously very curious to see the outcome of this wonderful research project. I don't see any other questions. It's also 5:15, so maybe we can wrap up the session. There's one.
Ik had nog één.
Sorry, Michiel. You have the last question then.
Ja, ik heb maar weer even opgetypt, want jij spreekt het zo goed uit, Eveke.
Okay, so just a bit of translation. Michiel would like me to read out his question, and then we'll give Paul and Laurence the time to respond to that. So how do you think we can avoid giving the underprivileged or even students the false idea of participation by glorifying Western democracies, so that they think they have a real say in global politics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the question of potential co-optation and tokenism, and where one person, a particular group, it used to be a woman or a racial minority and so on, are placed in positions. But I think that we have to really open up structures, systems, processes, have people address what is it they mean by inclusion, what is it they mean by social justice, what are the plans, what are the objectives, what are what is the funding, the policies, all of these things together can give us a sense of where we're at. Putting one person in power doesn't really change that much, but it's a whole range of things. And I think that in my own research over the years on racism, I have yet to meet one person, racialized person, one person in any country who has said to me after, you know, a meaningful, authentic conversation that racism doesn't exist, that it's a joke, we should finish with it, that everyone knows it exists, but it is so entrenched in people's guts and hearts and souls and minds that it's difficult to even enunciate because they know that there's white power and privilege. So I think that we have to really have these honest, deliberative discussions and then follow it up with policies, funding, and so on. I think that most students, you know, I'll say of color in quotations, or understand that there's a racial shell game going on. And to use race as an example, we could talk about classism, we could talk about poverty and other things, but there's a power structure in place. And I think we have to, normative democracy proclaims that it's more open and more transparent and more progressive. Well, then it should be then. It should more clearly document what type of data are we gathering and why, what types of policies, who is included. And up until now, the two-party system, for the most part, I'm saying two-party, it could be a couple more, but they share power, and really people on the outside are really excluded for generations. And it is gut-wrenching to meet people who say, well, my family have 5 generations or 10 generations of dropouts. This is a real indictment of our system. So in a roundabout way, what I'm saying is that I think we have to democratize our system so that we can get to these questions here about underprivileged kids, rather than start with the premise that we are a democracy. But I think we should be more engaged in improving it.
Small question is, shouldn't it be fair if we give our students a real insight in how power structures work in society, so that we don't project shiny future goals of results for them that are unachievable in the end?
Yeah, well, I think that on the one hand, we have the notion, at least in, you know, I'm in Canada, but the American dream, if you work hard, you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you will excel, you will win, you will achieve. Should we be more honest and direct by saying, well, there's a better chance that you might be in prison or you might not have a job? But the reality is, I think that Obama was very successful at this Pygmalion concept, projecting we're better than this, and this vision of what we should be. But I think that we have to be more authentic in teaching about social inequalities and injustices. And it's not just because the person, you know, has certain qualities that person did not succeed. There are discriminatory barriers and so on. So I think at the same time, I mean, I firmly believe that we have to provide hope, we have to work with people, but I think we should be focused on social justice and working on defeating some of these social injustices, especially in relation to social class, gender, race, xenophobia. But I think that it's a bit pie in the sky to think that everything is good, and because we can point to a couple people who have succeeded, because we have large communities. I'm not sure in the Netherlands, but in most societies, there are communities of people that are more racialized, more poverty, more segregated. And I think we should try to understand why. Why is that?
Yeah, and I think, again, thank you for your question, Michiel. It would actually merit another big conversation to pursue this topic, you know, in more depth. Laurence, is there anything you would like to add?
Yes, I mean, I would like to be careful to say democracy is typical Western and things like that, because there have been a lot of discussion between the South and the Western and the East about what does it mean democracy. And as long as we stay discussing about this concept, and as Paul said at the beginning, democracy is an ideal about how we would like society to develop and to be run and organized. And this is a concept we can continuously improve, and including the voices that are not heard, always heard. We can make steps to improve this, the way we are functioning as a system. So I think it's again, yes, a topic for next big conversation.
Yes,
so interesting.
Let's make sure that we find a suitable format to continue this particular conversation. But I would like to end our conversation for today. Once again, thank you so much, Paul, for a very thought-provoking session, and Laurence also for putting in your insights and perspectives. I think it was a very valuable session, and once again, thank you. And thank you to all the participants who've joined us from different countries as well. I'll make the recording available, and Paul has also kindly agreed that the slides can be shared, I think. Isn't right, Paul? So all of that is still following. For now, I would like to wish all of you a wonderful day or a great evening, depending on where you are, and well, stay connected to the big conversations, and I'd like to welcome you back for a next conversation. Bye for now.
Thank you, Eveke.
Many thanks.
Yes.
All the best, Laurence, Eveke, and everyone.
Merci, Paul. Merci beaucoup.